I think very often our role as HR leaders there is to kind of steer people back a little bit to say, remember, this is why we are doing these things. This is where this will lead for us.
You're listening to HR Superstars, a podcast brought to you by 15Five. On this show, we talk to strategic people leaders who are making a meaningful impact in their organizations and shaping the future of work. So get ready to be inspired and discover the secrets behind building high-performing teams and fostering a culture of growth and thriving. The future of HR starts here. One of the things that I think you'll actually hear in this podcast coming up with Dieter and Dana is that whenever I get a concern from an executive leader, especially a CEO, one of the most useful things I can do is actually ask more questions instead of just throwing them a solution. So if what you're hearing from your CEO is, hey, like 15Five, does it overlap with this other thing? Or is our HRIS overlapping with something else? And what about this goal tool that I want? What I would actually do is just take a few steps back and talk to them about, let's figure out, one, what's the biggest priority right now for the year? Tools aside, what are the commitments we have to deliver? And you get that list and you say, great. In order to deliver that, it sounds like these are the skills and competencies we need in our organization. One, do we know? Do we have a measurement on those? Do we need to get those? And do we have tools that can actually help us increase those skills across our organization? So I would maybe first take a few steps back with your CEO, do a little bit of investigation and digging, and then actually talk about what are the things you have at your disposal, right? 15Five included in one of those tools in your tool suite now that can really help you hit and drive those goals. This may be a great learning opportunity for your CEO to understand more of the functionality and capability 15Five has that they may not have even been aware of before. But, as HR leaders, we're navigating some of the most complex parts of an organization. And at the same time, we're asked to give clear, specific answers to solve the company's biggest problems. And what I see happen with HR leaders is that in an effort to build our influence and credibility, we often jump straight into answering instead of pausing to ask better questions and start more meaningful conversations. And that intentional practice is one that lends itself perfectly to our role in HR as strategic advisors and helps our companies make better decisions that ultimately lead to better outcomes. Today, I'm joined by two people who come at this from very different perspectives and experience. I'm so happy to have them here. First is Dana Calder, SVP of People at Spreedly, making real decisions with real constraints. Dana brings a really practical view on simplifying programs and designing work that actually moves outcomes. And I'm also joined by a previous HR Superstars podcast guest and expert, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, Chief HR Scientist at AI HR, who works with companies like the ones you're at, like 15Five, all across industries to help HR teams make sense of their data. And so together, we're going to walk through 5 questions that really lead to better outcomes. Dana and Dieter, welcome. It's so nice to have you both here. Dana, I'm going to start with you first. My favorite question to ask people is, give me the movie trailer version of your life that got you from where you started to where you are today at Spreedly.
Well, happy to join you, Karina. I can certainly do that. Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Calder. I came up actually through go-to-market. I don't have a traditional HR background. I came through the business. I've worked in a lot of fast-growing SaaS companies, working shoulder to shoulder with product, sales, finance, engineering, the leadership teams. And I made the pivot 6 years ago into people operations at Spreedly, a fintech organization, really that came about through coaching and working closely with leaders and getting the opportunity to think about repositioning people operations more from a go-to-market lens. These employees are my customers. So what does it look like to support their growth, help them thrive, and do it in a customer-centric way? And so that's been my approach for this time at Spreedly, and I'm excited to be here.
Love that. I love you bringing that perspective. Dieter, I've already asked you once in the last 6 months to give you the movie trailer version. Now I'm going to ask you to give me the Olympic announcer special version of who is Dieter as he enters this competition.
Wow, I think, Karina, lovely to be here with you again. And hi, Dana, and everybody else listening. I was about to say, I don't know what genre the movie trailer would be. So maybe the Olympic announcement is a little bit more focused on how did he get here and why is he competing. But on a serious note, I've always been somebody that's loved human behavior and how human behavior leads us to make better decisions. So I started career in organizational psychology and in human resource management. and then kind of moved around, first big corporate, from there niche consulting. From there I ran an HR tech business for a couple of years, went back to big corporate. I was a CHRO, became a professor, and then kind of combined all those different things today. So I don't know what the right wording for is, but maybe it's like a duathlon or something that I tried to
Yeah.
do along the way. And that kind of leads me to where I am today as the chief research scientist, where I try to combine practice with theory and help HR professionals know what are the skills that gets them ahead in the future of work. So lovely to be with you.
Awesome. I absolutely love that. Well, today we're going to go through kind of 5 big questions. And the first question we're really going to talk about is, what is the data that we have actually telling us about where we need to focus? It's one of the biggest blockers I see, and I'm sure you two do often with HR leaders. Dana, I want to start with you. How do you determine what deserves your attention at any given moment?
Certainly. Starts with just chatting with leadership, from our executive team to our senior leaders, to understand what are our big goals for 2026. What does that look like from our planning perspective? What are we saying in terms of financial metrics we're trying to hit? What does that look like? So understanding that from leadership first helps inform for the team and I what we focus on. And then overlaying that in terms of the engagement survey data we get from 15.5, we run that twice a year. We can segment that data to understand from the employees, what's the experience looking like? Where can we gain clarity? Where do we need to shore that up? Where do we need to work on? Where do we need to add additional support? So that those insights, along with looking at what from a planning perspective are we focusing on, allows us to understand where we need to focus for 2 to 3 of our priorities for 2026.
I love it. And what's the advice you give to your team so they're not chasing too many insights? Like, I know sometimes when I open up an engagement survey, like I just have to, it's kind of like how I pack for a trip. I got to just like take everything out of my closet first. And then I like slowly determine I don't need 75% of this. But I feel that way sometimes with data, where I'm just like, I'm going to look at everything and intentionally overwhelm myself before I refine. What's the advice you give to your team to help them refine on what matters?
Well, I think part of that now is utilizing AI as a partner here. Is yes, we're getting so much data when we look at things like goal support. What are we doing in terms of our managers? What is it looking at like from a departmental perspective? And for the team, we can reflect and look on how things looked the past 6 months to see what insights there are. But we can now utilize AI to help us quickly scan and ask specific prompts like, what's changed with this engagement survey? Where do we need to focus on? What patterns are we seeing here? And that allows us to start to cascade down and look and see, where do we need to spend more time with specific teams? Where do we need them to give them actionable insights in terms of what they need to focus on? So that way you don't get overwhelmed with the data. Sure, we're getting so much data and there's so much that can be right at our fingertips, but you're right, Karina, it can be very overwhelming. So then we drill down in terms of that. It allows us to really focus with our leaders on what are the areas we need to work on, or where can we go, thumbs up, this is looking great for now. We don't need to give it that much attention.
Exactly. Well, I'm sure that's helpful too when like you have an executive who comes out of the left field with like, I want to focus on this priority for this quarter. Can you roll out a brand new program on this random thing that I listened to a podcast about 4 hours ago? Like it helps give us the tools to be able to respond and say, I love that you're passionate about this topic, but remember we committed to these company goals. This is what the data is telling us. Like, let me keep you on track. Dieter, tell me how that all resonates with you. What does that recall from your experience?
No, definitely. And I think, there's a couple of things that I do think happens very often with business leaders, as Dana's also mentioned. I think there's a big part where sometimes we suffer from shiny newness syndrome. So whatever is new on the horizon, people just want to run after, not knowing that some decisions that we've made actually takes time to come to fruition. So I think very often our role as HR leaders there is kind of steer people back a little bit to say, remember, this is why we are doing these things. This is where this will lead for us, kind of in future. I can definitely resonate with what Dana's mentioned there around the fact that I think the overwhelm is very often the big enemy, where people then start looking at data and saying, but there's just too much. What do I actually do with it? And I think to be able to distinguish between what is interesting versus what is useful is quite an important one when we start thinking about how do we really unpack this. But yeah, Karina, there's kind of, if I can dive into 2 things here, I think that's really important, when we start thinking about this, is I think there's always this idea around the fact that very often there's lack of clarity on strategic choices, right, in the organization and what that actually means in practice. Now, I know that sounds fluffy, but when we start looking at data, you need to look at data that answers a specific business question that you have, because just looking at data for data's sake doesn't really move you forward. And I think if you don't critically always analyze and ask that business leader that comes to you to say, it's great you want to do this thing, but why and what is it solving for that we have said is important for us? I think that's such an important conversation to have, because that creates that clarity. And then the second point there is that then also helps you with the prioritization, because I think the big thing in today's world is there's a lot of things that we don't know. So if you just run after absolutely everything, you'll end up being nothing to no one, because you're never really going to double down on the strategic bets that you have. So for me, if there's one word you take out of this, it's that how do you create clarity for people, and how do you help data to continuously put you on that path? I think that's so important today.
Yeah. And I think about that as like a really important mindset shift from the very early days of my HR career to where I'm at now, is moving from being the goer and the doer and the like, you've got a question, I can solve it, which is a lot of times like what ends us up in HR, because we have a bias for action. We want to get things done. We can move quickly. Like that's a great skill to have. But as you get working more closely with leadership and you become more senior in your roles, it is, to your point, Dieter, about taking the time to get really clear. And that's not about creating unnecessary confrontation or conflict, but just, hey, like, I love that you have this idea. To your point, help me understand how this is connected to the top 3 priorities we just talked about with the executive team, because I want to know. And it's about giving people that space for reflection too, because we all do it. Like sometimes we get excited about ideas and we need someone to be our thought partner. And so I think for all of us to really position ourselves like that puts us in that place of influence, of trust with our executive leaders. Dana, have you worked through kind of that similar experience in your career?
I have. And I think with working with the executives and with senior leaders, they can sometimes have a thought or insight related to how their team is working. And so being able to be that thought partner for them on, oh, I am seeing that show up in the survey data. How are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about tackling that? Can I provide some insight or some guidance on how maybe we approach that together? So that level of partnership where it's not that only that we own the data, they might be experiencing that, noticing it, and the data might help cement for them, yes, that's real, that is showing up. So now what's the action plan? So as their partner, we get the opportunity to do that, to work together and then track it together to see how are we doing towards resolving or making, actionable insights or change towards that experience or what they're trying to work towards.
This challenge of building credibility behind the data, especially in a world where, like, we all know someone on our team who plugs in emails and you're like, that is ChatGPT talking. Like, I know it. It's not, you have yet to like refine it. Dieter, what are some of the tips you would give for people to ensure that they're talking about their data, I guess, with confidence and they can really speak to the credibility behind it?
No, I think it's a great point. And I think to get started first, and I think sometimes in HR, there's almost a bit of a misbelief that we have that we are not good at data, or we are not good at the translation of data. And I actually give a lot of advice to HR leaders or HR professionals to say, rely on what you are good at and utilize that to then start utilizing data in that way. So let me make it super practical. I think we are really great storytellers as HR professionals. I think we are really, really great at critical thinking and at stakeholder management. And how can you start utilizing those skill sets that you have and then start using the data much more in that particular context and to start pushing things through there as well? There's obviously some hygiene factors. Can we trust where the data comes from? Are the right controls in place? I know for a lot of people that is still a challenge. But the other side is also, and I love Dana's comment earlier that she made around the fact that very often the data is at your fingertips. We sometimes think the data is only the quantitative things that we pull from, from the surveys and the systems that we have. That is kind of the breadth of data that we get. But sometimes the depth is this conversations that you have with the leaders and triangulating those different things. So rely on what you are good at, but take that first step. We are much better at data than what we think we are as HR professionals, but lean into it from what you are good at, as opposed to immediately jump into the things that might not necessarily be, a strong suite there. So it's a bit more of a mindset change. I think there's a hard skill set that people need to learn, but for me, in my experience, it's mindset. Get people there, get them curious, get them to ask questions with you. And you don't need to have all the answers through data. Very often you can say, that's a really good question. Let us go back to the data and actually see whether the hypothesis is true or not, or whether there's something else at play here. But get started and get over that first hurdle.
I absolutely love that. And, one of the big challenges that people come across is kind of second big question we hear from leaders is, what do we do when we want to make an impact, but we don't have the headcount, the resources? How do we just simplify what we focus on? I'm curious, Dana, how do you protect simplicity as more stakeholders start to get involved in different programs or initiatives?
How do you do leadership development if you don't have budget for it? And I think as HR leaders, we tend to be the individuals who are extensively reading. We're reading from different individuals who are giving their perspective related to manager enablement, professional development, how you grow, how do you have constructive conversations within your organization. So one tactic I've done in terms of simplicity is I'm a big Brene Brown fan. I love Dare to Lead. I'm constantly rereading that. And I just threw it to the organization who would be interested in doing a book club. And I was pretty astounded at how many people from emerging leaders to our current leaders were interested in that. And so as an organization, I have a book club that I run monthly. I'm trying to keep it light. I think as HR leaders, we could probably orchestrate this into a very robust course right off the bat. I'm just trying to keep it light. A couple questions that I ask just to start the conversation and what are some key takeaways, and putting some resources from the Dare to Lead hub in there for individuals to have as takeaways. And that seems to be very fulfilling for individuals right now. So that's a low stakes way. You probably have things on your shelf that you're really enjoying, and you probably could put it into something like a book club.
Yeah, I love that. Dieter, what's your advice to really, I guess, just help teams strip back to what matters? Because I know, Dana, I can get caught up in the same thing you described too, which is like, oh, you need a program? I can make a program. I'll like punch one out in the next 20 minutes, but it doesn't always need to be this big, heavy thing. Sometimes we just need to go back to basics. So Dieter, what's your advice on that?
No, I definitely think so. And I mean, I think you mentioned earlier that I think we often fall into the efficiency trap as HR professionals, because that's typically at the beginning of whether your background is in HR or elsewhere. We find that that's what gets rewarded, right? You get rewarded for getting things done, being action focused and action oriented. I think as you start moving through your career, there's been two things when we ask the simplicity question for me that kind of signals that you might be in trouble. The first one is if you cannot identify why we are doing this in a very clear way. And I know it sounds so silly, but we've all sat in those meetings and you're like, just hang on, help me understand, where does that initiative fit again? Why are we investing in this? I think that tells us a little bit that we're veering off the path that's easy for people to connect the dots and spot the patterns on what the impact is going to be. And then the second part for me is there when we struggle to define what success is going to look like. So something I often ask people whenever they launch a new initiative is, what is going to be different if we do a good job with regards to this? Because if you can't answer that, and you can't really, and I've got a colleague that always challenges us on this, regardless of conversation, he's like, what problem are you solving? What is the intent behind this? And what is actually going to look different once we've done this in a successful way? For me, if the answers to those questions become very clouded, become unclear, become difficult to answer, for me, that's a little bit of a signal that we might be veering off the path a little bit too much. So that questioning curiosity piece, but hold yourself honest. We're good at defending why we are doing things. That's not the purpose of this. Sometimes the purpose here is to look in the mirror and say, I've spent a lot of time on this initiative, but I actually don't know whether it's the right thing or whether we've veered off course too much.
Completely. Dieter, I think we might have the same coworker because when you said that, I can think of it. And, there are times when you get those questions and it is like you feel that instant defense of like, well, why would you ask me that? Does it mean you don't trust me? Right. And what I think is, one, you want to make sure that you do have, and you're having those conversations in a space with people you trust, because once you have that barrier down, it's like, okay, this person's not asking me because they think I'm incompetent. They're asking me because, like me, they're responsible for the outcomes of this business. And I need to make sure that where I'm investing my time and energy is actually what matters. And if it's okay that if you can't give the 2 to 3 liners to answer those questions, to say, maybe this isn't a priority. And sometimes I feel like we all get afraid, different leaders in different functions, to say, this isn't a good use of our time. Let's actually change course, right? And be okay with like, we tried, we thought, but we need to do something different. That pulling the plug is sometimes the best answer.
Yeah, and it's a big thing to do, right? I think we are initially wired to see things through and to say, but I almost attach my personal value to this initiative that I'm driving. And I think sometimes it becomes tough then to realize that you are not the value of the initiative. Your value lies elsewhere. And often having those open conversations leads towards more trust in the longer term. But it's a tough one to go ask that question. But, I've seen with a lot of organizations, if you're open to that conversation with the leaders around the table, you actually gain a lot of respect and eventual trust if you're able to bring that to the table.
Yeah, I had to write that down. You are not the value of your initiative. Like those are two different, which can be just so easy to attach ourselves to. Completely. Well, and so we've got 3 more questions to tackle for our folks here. The next one is about exit surveys. And what are exit surveys telling us about the effectiveness of our programs? Dana, I'm really curious to get your take on this. How do you review exit feedback? What do you look for? What is your perspective on exit data?
So I think of exit data as the flip side of the engagement survey. I have a group that's here, staying active, wants to give me feedback as they're experiencing being within the organization. The value I see in exit survey data is you have individuals who are leaving, and it's a good chance we have a pretty robust survey of what's going on from a total rewards experience standpoint. And sometimes I forget to look at that data. I can, kind of leave it there like it's a checkbox. I did it. But I had the opportunity recently to really look back and with AI review to see if there's any patterns or any big items that we're not noticing that are impacting experience. And I was able to overlay that with the engagement survey and find some areas where, from a strategic perspective, we could be doing things better from an organizational standpoint. And pulling that together to do a robust summary of what we're hearing really impacted and helped our executive team recognize where we could shore up things from maybe a product or engineering standpoint to create a better experience. Some of the information we're getting are from happy leavers who want the organization to be better. So you have all of this depth and time that they've spent telling you what they would love to see in terms of the organization thriving. So it can be really beneficial to see if there's some key themes or patterns there to address or scale up to your executive or senior leadership team.
Oh yeah, it's that triangulation, right? Of like, okay, I'm hearing some of the engagement survey. I'm seeing how it's now showing up in exit surveys. I'm also having these 4 conversations happening within the org at the same time, really seeing how those patterns come together. What's the advice that you would give to HR leaders and how to bring that feedback to executives in a constructive way, especially when the feedback or data is hard to read?
Yeah, I can also be guilty of having more of an emotional storytelling standpoint where it doesn't always resonate or move forward with our executive team or senior leaders. So I've been able to partner with our chief of staff and also utilize AI to really refine it into a first draft of like a business executive summary. And that has allowed for thinking through, okay, how do I bring this more without bringing emotion here? It is more fact-based. It is more related to what the organizational shifts could be and keeping it high level and concise. Can't get past 1 page. I know that I lose the audience. And with doing that, that has really helped with bringing it to our executive team and getting insight from my CEO related to what worked or what needs to be refined in terms of those summaries. So I think of it as iterative. You maybe don't get it right the first time, but keep going, keep refining it. And you'll find that it really does help your organization and your leaders.
Just measuring employee performance is no longer enough. 15.5 helps your HR team take action to maximize performance. With 15.5's performance management platform, you can easily set up review cycles, collect ongoing performance data, track employee goals, and deploy customized campaigns that empower managers to drive growth. Learn more at 15.5.com or click the link in the show notes.
I absolutely love that you said that you use AI to do that, Dana, because I have this series of little cat Post-it notes on my desk that I've been using as a reminder, because I've been using AI to like coach even myself on like, how do I get to the really clear message? And what this Post-it says for everyone who's curious is mechanisms, not behaviors, cause, not consequence, clarity. And this is like my reminder of like, what am I talking about when I'm giving a summary of a problem? And like, it is that partnership. Like, we're not meant to always know all these things together, whether it's you have a peer in the organization, you're using AI as a support, you're coming to sessions like this to figure it out. Like, it is a muscle to build to give really clear, objective, unbiased feedback. That's a tough thing to do. Dieter, I'm sure you see this in working with organizations all the time too.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's you're absolutely right. I think, and Dana, I think you called it out spot on around the fact that I think there's either a tendency kind of put your own views and emotions into the room around what the data says, especially very often if we think that it reflects on ourselves as the HR, practitioner or professional. Or on the other side, we become so fact-oriented and fact-based that we forget that it exists in a bigger context, right? And then we just stand there and are reiterating the numbers. And then we get into this conversation a lot more about, how valid is exit surveys? We only do this once. So how are we summarizing these different areas there as well? So I think there is a piece there on finding that middle ground. And for me, it's always been around put these things into context and connect them to things that people care about. So I think especially with exit interview data or exit survey data, very often there is a tendency to start connecting it only to other HR metrics. And then we think that that's a good story to tell. Now, that's great, I think, for certain decisions, but you need to take it one step further around connecting it to things that the business would also care about. And to make it practical, some things I've seen there is one of the metrics I love to look at over time is something called manager quality. So what does that tell us over time about the quality of our management layer? Because that we know it influences engagement. We know it influences things over the longer term. But is there actually trends and patterns that we can pick up over time? Because I think that's the big thing. It needs to be rolling insights that you get. It can't just be at a point in time and then we say, oh, we've done better now. Let's look at what it looked like, last quarter. It has to start giving you those trend lines that I think is going to be really important. And then on the other side, also then to start thinking about the leading and lagging areas that you can spot consequence. So what I mean by that is, what does that tell us about what is going to happen? So if we start seeing certain themes in our exit survey or exit interview data, what does that tell us based on the past around what risks we might face in the future? Because that's a business discussion, right? It's things about talent capacity. It's things about risk and retention risk for the future. But also on the other side, what can we improve? Because we also know alumni talent is a great source of future talent pool, boomerang talent. We talk about that a lot as well. So I think there is just that piece around putting it into the context, connecting it to what matters, and then using it in a longitudinal way and not in a way that just, I bring the data to you once a year when we talk about this. Make it part of the normal conversation so business leaders also get used to what they're looking at.
That data is going to become stale almost as soon as your survey is done, because the rate at which companies change, people change, right? We need to have, to your point, those rolling insights in some way to say what actually matters to people right now. And how can I get that data in an easy, lightweight way? Because again, we can't be in every conversation all the time to know. And right, I think manager quality too, to what you shared. I'm curious how you've thought about this, Dana, too. Like that is such an important measure to have, right? One of the most important people metrics, even beyond engagement. Engagement can just be so broad, but what are my managers doing? What are the behaviors they demonstrate, the behaviors they do not demonstrate? And can I correlate that with some of those consequences, those outcomes that I might be seeing in my department? Is that something that you work on, Dana, within your teams and thinking about manager quality?
Yes, absolutely. I think part of that segmentation of the engagement survey allows me to see where are we seeing performance? Where are we seeing our manager quality? Where are we seeing managers thrive? Where do we see maybe someone who's got stronger emotional intelligence? Because when we think about that, we can think about partnering an individual who needs a little bit more support in that area with someone who is thriving and leading the way within the organization. So it's so important for me to be able to look at that closer to see where we have opportunities. And then some of the upward feedback we'll get from our performance reviews we run through 15.5 give us an opportunity to hear from the team, the organization, what's working, where do we need more support for our managers in terms of elevating their quality. But most importantly, we want to give them the opportunity to also tell us what does their professional development, what does that look like for them, and surveying and asking based off of the content we have in 15.5 for the manager section, what would you like to focus on? What do you want to focus your development on? Giving them the voice and the autonomy to drive that forward and say, okay, I'm presenting this to you because you said this was important to you and this is where you wanted to grow. So I don't want it to be more directed from me as their HR leader of, okay, this is what you need to do to get better, but how do you want to grow your career? What does that look like? And I want to give you the right level of agency to have a voice and stake in it.
And what a great way to get leaders actually invested in a program by having them feel heard, feel seen, and that it's personalized. It's not, I looked on LinkedIn and you look like you've been a people manager for 4 years, so you're now invited to like this cohort of group, right? I love taking that approach. This would not be an event in 2026 if we didn't have a question here about AI, because everything we're talking about, we're doing is some way incorporating AI. So our next big question is, how can we better incorporate AI to spot patterns we might be missing in data? Dieter, let me start with you. Where do you see AI adding the most value when it comes to understanding data, spotting trends, and then just understanding it better?
I think for me, the starting point there is to understand what AI is really good at, right? And AI is really good at spotting patterns across various different sources of data that you might not naturally pick up, right? I think there's a tendency in HR, we still look at data very in functional silos very often, and we don't necessarily look at it in its whole breadth. And I think that's really where AI plays a key fundamental role about unearthing new insights that we might not have reached before. It still requires human beings to interpret what that actually means for us, but it is in a much more digestible, always on real time type of way that we can start looking at that as well. There's obviously on the other side also things that we can utilize it for in terms of like the hygiene factors, like the data cleaning, making sure everything's in the right place, etc. But for me, the real value is more in the pattern spotting. How do we highlight things? There's an organization that, for example, utilizes it to stress test their HR strategy. So they'll take the HR strategy and then utilize AI to say, given what we know about the macro environment and these 5 things that's hitting our business, what am I missing in my HR strategy? So I think if you start thinking about it in that way, it actually then provides us with a lot of non-traditional value, if I might call it that way, where it becomes a consultative partner on the one side, but on the other side, it also brings a skill set that you might not have had access to in your organization.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I love the idea of stress testing, right? Sometimes it is just nice to be like, what did I not hear? Or sometimes I'll ask whatever tool I'm using, like, hey, be this employee with this perspective. Or I know there's a group that's going to react like this. Like, help me think through and get ahead of some of those things. Dana, where do you see AI saving you and your team's time today?
Well, I love what Dieter said about the pattern and stress testing and spot checking. We certainly use it currently to make certain, from the exit survey data to the engagement survey, where are we seeing any specific patterns? But it can also be like thinking about change management. If you're doing change management, thinking about your communications, helping with communications to leaders or to the organization, what does that look like to do a sentiment check? How is that going to be perceived? Oftentimes that's a big question mark. And so now I can use AI to do a sentiment check. How would that be perceived? Where do we need to refine this? Where do we need to think about this? Where can we ensure that we're adding the right level of tone for this message? And so that has been very helpful for the team, and also with partnering with our leaders and thinking about that. And then I would say, in terms of, oftentimes I'm asking my peers, what are you doing over there? How are you approaching your job descriptions, or how are you approaching strategy? I can now use AI and say, we're an organization this size and this is our revenue and this is what we're trying to achieve. Is that in line? Is there anything else I should be thinking about in terms of strategy or this job description or how we're approaching this? So it can also be that partner for you if you can't oftentimes reach out to another HR leader.
Yeah, I love that. Dieter, what do you think that most HR teams are just overthinking about AI right now? What's a blocker for them?
Well, I think the one big thing is that I think there's still the perception that I need to be a data scientist to utilize AI effectively, which we know is not the case ever since Gen AI has become a lot more user-friendly, over the last 3 years or so. I think there is also that component around the fact that they think AI is unsafe to use. So I think if you educate yourself well pertaining to what can you do and what should you not do and what is good practice and what you are using and understanding those tools in your own context, I think it then opens up HR professionals a lot more to see the possibilities of AI utilization in our general workflows. I think if we don't do that, we run the risk, and I think that's happening at the moment, where people say, it's interesting, but it's not that useful. So what do I actually get business value from it? Because they're not putting it into their normal ways of work. They're kind of seeing it as something that I use separately. And I love Dana's example there around actually doing it in terms of the processes that you are busy with. And I think if you can cross that barrier, that AI is not just a tool that you utilize, it's something that you integrate into the way you work, the way you think through what you do, the way that you collaborate, I think that sets you up for success. But to do that, you need that first initial thinking that it's a good thing. I am able to utilize it. I'm going to teach myself as we go through. I'm going to learn from others. And it is actually safe to use if I follow these guardrails that has been put down in my organization.
Yeah, I think those are such great principles. And, even thinking back to something that you said earlier, Dieter, too, we're like, we have to lean on what we're good at. So if you feel like I'm a great critical thinker, I'm good at being the one to push back and ask questions, well, great. Then you should actually feel like AI tooling capability can be a partner to you, something you can lean in on to say, okay, like I see you're telling me this, but like, let me ask you these questions to get to the root, and really being able to just have those tools at your disposal that can be in your flow of work, right? Like anything that feels, of course, like it's going to be not additive to what you're doing, or it's going to add more time to my day. I see why people hesitate, but I also see people sometimes feeling a little less inclined to just experiment and play. Be like, try thinking about what could you do with AI. Sometimes the possibilities are so big. It's like we start nowhere. We're like, well, I'll just do it later. We'll pick one element of those. Okay, with performance reviews, like I need to be able to come out of a review and really understand my biggest hotspots. Great. Like, do you have a tool that can help you do that, where you can ask questions, where you can connect it back to what you were saying earlier, Dana, to your engagement survey data, your exit data? How can you really triangulate in a way, or even just get the wheels moving on that part? Or even when it comes to manager enablement, right? Like I think, like we were talking about earlier, just having something that can be there to help you coach and personalize what you're doing for your managers, give them that training that is actually meaningful for them, that they want to engage in. Dana, for you, what feels really useful and manageable when it comes to AI for, kind of you and your in-house team? What are some of the ways that you're using it most?
Yes, on the recruiting side, we're using it quite extensively when it comes to our job descriptions. Part of it is oftentimes we're thinking about it from the seat of the leader that we're working closely with. And so part of that is just customizing it a little further. So we take another step to ask leaders, what does a top performer look like to you? How are you perceiving this role? If you go out to market, what does that look like? A lot of recruiters, we are probably doing a lot of calibration. I would say capture that calibration if possible, and then really look at the job description and maybe potentially scan it and say, how can I improve this job description based off of this transcript from this leader? And then you're almost marrying the tone of that leader to the job description. And what we found here at Spreely is it performs better. It really speaks to the candidate. And where I can show that success to our leaders is now we have better time to hire, time to fill, and we're having a stronger candidate pipeline pool. And so that is an efficiency gain. I don't know about you all, but writing job descriptions constantly or rewriting it for a different leader, or I want this, that feels like a waste of my time. I cannot sit here and keep doing that and looking at other people's job descriptions. So outsourcing that to AI feels like a good efficiency gain.
I love it. Sometimes it's even just taking the time as a leader to say, what are the parts of my job right now that are not a good use of my time, that I am not on, that I find myself constantly going back to? Even just thinking through that is such a valuable activity. Actually, I'm a visual person. I need to sometimes see it in all my cat Post-it notes all over my desk of like, oh, that's what's happening. Okay, like now I know I've got to tackle that problem. For our last big question for the folks today is really about how can we use data more meaningfully without getting overwhelmed? Dieter, I want to start with you. What do you feel is the simplest path from insight to action?
So I think it summarizes a lot of the things that we've spoken about already. But for me, there's 3 points that I think gets you to action faster when you start looking at data. The first one is always be clear on what question am I asking of the data. I think that avoids the risk of overwhelm that we've spoken about before. Secondly, from there, I think then to ask the question, what can this data actually answer and what can it not answer? So we've spoken a lot about triangulation. So maybe I need something else that really is able to give me a good answer to that question. And then the third one, what action can I take because of what I now know? And linking that back to what the original question was. Now, I know it sounds like 3 such simple things, but it kind of keeps you honest through the process of looking at data to avoid that you go down a rabbit hole and then eventually says, oh, all of this was really, really interesting. I don't know how useful it was in terms of what I was trying to do with this as well. So I think keep yourself honest there. And if you haven't worked with data a lot, I would say just start with something simple that you know really, really well, because that will build your confidence over time. So don't try, the very first time that you're trying to draw insights, take a process that you also don't know well. So I think start with what you know, build the confidence there, test that over time, and kind of keep those 3 things top of mind. What's the question I'm asking? Can this data answer it? And what action can I take?
I love it. Dana, how does that resonate with you? And what's kind of the same advice you would give?
Yeah, I love what Dieter said related to, how you're managing that data moving through it, because it can be very overwhelming. Just take the most simplistic approach first, I think, because my tendency when I first started with AI is I want to do all the things. I want to do them really well. But the first step I wanted to do is have clarity in terms of my communications with leadership. And so I took that first of what does that look like? What am I trying to say? How will that resonate with my audience? How can I refine it? I still want to keep my tone and voice, but I also want to see what clarity looks like. So I would say take a simplistic approach first, work on an area, maybe even for your own development that you're thinking, okay, I want to grow that specific skill, and see how that partnership with AI can help you achieve that.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. Dieter, when you think about kind of one skill or one place to start, for people who are leaving here today, like, okay, I'm going to become more data informed. That's my goal. Like by the end of this week, I'm going to do one thing. What is one thing that people could do to strengthen that muscle?
I think the moment that you leave here is to ask yourself the question, what data do I already have? Because I think if you're going to get started with big data collection exercises, I think that almost delays your ability to start really diving into the data. So go and take a look at what do I already have, and ask yourself one question in terms of what you want to know from that data. Don't go with a complex hypothesis. Ask one question around something that's important or that you are curious about, and just see where that leads you. Again, keep the other things that we've spoken about in mind. So it's not just exploring for exploration's sake, but I think it is to get your hands dirty and to just get started. I think to strengthen that muscle, it's very much like coming back to your very first question around the Olympics. It's about getting fit and training for the Olympics. You're not going to run, the 100 meters under 10 seconds immediately, but you need to start somewhere. So take out those jogging shoes and just at least walk around the block as a starting point.
I love that. Sometimes it is as simple as one question, because that can really just unlock your thinking elsewhere. When you see the answer to that question, it might be like, oh, well, actually, what I really want to know is something else. And now I know the context of the business goal I'm serving and how do I bring it all back together. So such incredible practical applications. But again, thank you so much for taking the time and being here with us today.
Engaged employees are your most valuable asset. They're innovative, loyal, and committed to achieving exceptional results. By fostering a culture of engagement, you'll unleash their full potential and create a competitive advantage that sets your organization apart. But how do you do it? Check out 15Five's Employee Engagement Playbook linked in the show notes. It explores the undeniable benefits of employee engagement and dives deep into how to measure it. I promise you'll learn actionable strategies to transform engagement insights into measurable outcomes.